Hello and welcome again to Backpage. I'm Jody C. and today we're visiting with Greg Nokes. And Greg has a way of swinging for the bleachers and managing to make it most of the time. So welcome back. We've had you on before.
Thank you, Jody. It's a pleasure to be here again.
And I'll explain what I mean by that, because there's a quality to the subjects that you write about where you force us to look at the shadow side, which is good. Your other book that we talked about was Massacred for Gold, which was about a massacre of some Chinese guys up in Hell's Canyon that went kind of...
34 Chinese gold miners in 1887.
Yeah, and there was nothing ever done about it, really, because the murderers were the son of a wealthy rancher and his pals, as I recall. Is that right?
A gang of horse thieves,
Yeah.
and there was a trial, and everybody was found innocent.
Yeah.
But this last June, we dedicated a memorial to the Chinese at Hell's Canyon, so a lot has been done that came out of that book.
Well, in this book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory, you don't really think about slavery in Oregon in the same sentence or context even, but we did have it here.
We did. I never thought about it that way,
Yeah.
right?
So there's always a genesis for a story. Tell me how this came about for you.
Well, I'd done the previous book and felt very rewarded because of how well it was received, and I thought it was an important book on the Chinese in the Northwest. And so I was looking for another book to write. I wanted to do another one. I had several subjects in mind. So I had coffee one day with my brother Bill and decided to bounce off him my various story ideas. And as I ran through several of them, he went, and then he said, "Why don't you write about Reuben Shipley?" And I said, "Well, who was Reuben Shipley?" And he said, "Reuben Shipley was a slave brought to Oregon by one of our early ancestors." I had no idea. I was stunned. Two things happened immediately. One, I had never thought there was a slaveholder in the background of my family. And two, I had thought from day one slavery was prohibited in Oregon and never heard that there was a slave in Oregon. So this was a good subject to pursue, both from a family standpoint and from telling Oregon history. And so I got into it and discovered there were actually quite a few slaves in Oregon.
Yeah. The reason being that when people came from Missouri and slave states, they often brought slaves with them because, like this guy, Nathaniel Ford, for example, what a creep.
What a creep.
Well, I mean, he had all these debts, you know, in Missouri where he was from, and so he had slaves. So as I understand it, he had Robin and Polly Holmes and their children, and he sold 3 of their children to try to pay off some of his debts, which wasn't enough. And then he promised Robin that if he went with him to Oregon, that he and his wife Polly could have their freedom. And he kept his word on that.
Yeah, that's a basic outline of the story. Nathaniel Ford was quite an important figure in Missouri.
Yeah.
He'd been a county sheriff in Howard County for 4 terms, member of the Missouri legislature, large landholder, and he had up to 13 slaves, counting the Holmes family. But he fell into economic hard times, lost some of his slaves, and sold, including 3 of the Holmes children, either sold or seized by his creditors, lost much of his property, and decided to come to Oregon, and brought 6 slaves with him, 3 adults and then 3 of the Holmes children. And that was in 1844. He led his own wagon train out here and settled in Polk County.
So the difficult part was, I mean, he figured out that to make it as a gentleman farmer, which he wanted to do in Oregon, because he would get the land basically for free if he got here, but he was going to have unpaid help, which would be the slaves. So he freed Robin and Polly, but wanted to keep their children.
He freed them after 6 years. I mean, Oregon did have a law against slavery enacted by the provisional government, early provisional government in 1843. But as a matter of practice, it was never enforced and was virtually unenforceable. Sort of a law without any teeth at all. And not a whole lot of settlers brought slaves. I'd guess there was probably 50 altogether in Oregon in this period. And that rather pales by the side the number in Missouri, I think, was 117,000 in 1860 and 4 million nationally.
Whoa.
So there weren't many slaves in Oregon, but a slave is a slave.
Yeah.
And The arrangement that many of the settlers made with their slaves was, well, if you come to Oregon and you help me establish my farm, and you're right, the land was free, and then they had the free labor, then I will free you.
Right.
And some of them did, including my ancestor, Robert Shipley, the white Shipley. He did free the slave Reuben Shipley after a couple of years. But Nathaniel Ford reneged on his promise, and he kept the Holmes family as slaves. The parents for 6 years, finally freeing them in 1850. And then the children he wanted to keep even longer than that. And finally in 1852, Robin Holmes, the father of the family, sued him in court in Polk County and ended up prevailing in a 15-month trial.
Yeah.
Which was quite remarkable, Jody, if I can continue. Slaves in those days, all of them that came to Oregon, as far as I know, were illiterate.
Right.
Slaves weren't allowed to be educated
Right.
in slave states. And so Robin Holmes and Reuben Shipley were both illiterate, but he managed to prevail in this suit, getting help from people.
Well, the other part about all of that is that in the slave states in the South, it was, if they found out a slave was able to read and write, it was punishable by death. And if you helped a slave learn how to read and write, you'd go to prison. So there was a wonderful book by Lois Levine called The Secrets of Mary Bowser. I don't know if you've read that
I've
or
not
not,
read that
but
one.
it's a good one, you know. And Mary Bowser was freed by her owner in Virginia, went to Pennsylvania and became educated, and then but she had a photographic memory, so they got her back into Virginia, and she set herself up as a household worker and in Jefferson Davis's mansion. So she'd be dusting with a feather duster and looking on his desk and remembering that's how one of the ways they lost. The South lost, yeah. So anyway, so what was the name of the judge? It was George Williams?
George Williams.
Yeah.
He was appointed by President Franklin Pierce to be the Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court. That was in 1853. And within weeks of coming to Oregon, he'd never been in Oregon before, he decided the Holmes versus Ford case, which is the title of the case. And 3 judges previously had been hearing this case, but nobody wanted to rule on it until Judge Williams came out. And there was a reason. Nathaniel Ford, who had been prominent in Missouri, quickly became prominent in Oregon. He was a 5-term member of the territorial legislature. He was actually nominated by the provisional government to be the first judge of Oregon, although he turned it down. But you can tell from this that when Robin Holmes sued him, he was up against a man with a great deal of influence. But Judge Williams, who came from New York originally, abolitionist influences and background, came out and quickly decided the case. And this was the only slavery case ever adjudicated in Oregon courts. I did not know there was ever a slavery case adjudicated in Oregon courts. Very little coverage at the time because there were very few newspapers in Oregon in this period. And I think that one of what was the Oregon Statesman then became the Salem Statesman. I think they gave it 3 paragraphs. Was all, and it was all virtually unknown in history. I mean, academics and historians know about it, but the general public really hasn't known about this.
So how old were their children when they got their children back from Nathaniel Ford?
Let's see, Mary Jane Holmes was 12, and she's the one we know most about. Then the others were a little bit older than that. Then one was younger. One had died. Actually, Ford kept 4 children, and one, Harriet, passed away. And this seemed to have energized Robin Holmes to bring this suit, fearing that all of the children would eventually perish under Nathaniel Ford. And this was one of his claims in this suit. Actually, it's quite a remarkable case, and the whole case is on file in Polk County. And so I was able to find it there. And he alleged that if the children stayed with Ford, he feared for their health and feared for their well-being, with reason, obviously.
Well, one of the things that seemed like he was planning to do was send them all back to Missouri and claim that they were runaway slaves. There was a letter that he'd written to a friend.
Yeah, I have that letter in the book. This became a central element at the trial because Robin Holmes said that apparently as he went to confront Ford, say, I want my children back. And Ford evidently told him, well, if you continue to press this issue, I'm going to seize you all under the Fugitive Slave Act and send you all back to Missouri as slaves. And he actually had made such a proposal. He had written an attorney friend in Missouri suggesting they work out a strategy to do this.
Yeah.
However, it never happened. And Ford never admitted that he actually had a real plan to do this, but a letter did surface showing that he had a very specific plan to do it.
Yeah. Well, did that letter surface before the judge ruled on the case?
No, the judge simply ruled, as far as I know, no. There was allegations. Holmes had alleged that Ford wanted to do this, and Ford said, well, I did have a plan, but I thought about it. People encouraged me to do it, but I never did. But no, the letter had not surfaced.
Yeah.
But Williams' ruling basically was that slavery is illegal in Oregon, that if there is no law, he kind of did the reverse. Rather than looking at a law that existed, he said, if there's no law approving slavery in Oregon, then slavery can't exist. And this was a definitive ruling that helped to put Oregon on the track to becoming a non-slave state. But there were many, many people in Oregon at that time, especially among the leaders, who were pro-slavery. And there was a very strident lobby favoring slavery.
Well, you know, even in the development of our country, you know, I mean, as I understand it, when they were writing the Constitution, they modeled it originally after the Iroquois Nation Constitution, until they realized that the Iroquois Nation did not allow for slavery. So they quickly changed it, because so many of them were slaveholders, and to model it after the Greek, which did allow for slavery. You know, so we're never quite as pure as we want.
No, in this case, it
think.
was, in fact, consider consider Joe Lane, who was the first territorial governor of Oregon,
Right.
the first U.S. senator, one of the first two U.S. senators from Oregon, very active pro-slavery. He ran for vice president on the same ticket with John Breckinridge of South Carolina on a secessionist ticket in 1860 against Abraham Lincoln. In fact, the former president, or the future president, Andrew Johnson, said on the floor of the Senate once that Joseph Lane is more Southern than the South itself. And he never gave up his support for slavery. And it's interesting to me that liberal Lane County is named after Joe Lane, who was a very ardent pro-slavery activist.
But then you have Joe Lane Middle School in Douglas County, so.
Oh, lots of, his name is in a lot of places.
Yeah, so how long did it take you to compile all of this information? Because there's a tremendous amount of research that had to happen to put this all together, I think.
It took about 2 years, and not as long as you might imagine, because I had enormous help from the Benton County Historical Society, the Polk County Historical Society, the Oregon Historical Society. All of these records are there. It's just a matter of somebody going to find them. And the people are very helpful. You know what you're looking for. I mean, people will help you to find them. I just found it extraordinary. Then old newspapers, cemetery records. You know, there's a cemetery in Benton County over near Rickreall called Mount Union Cemetery.
Yeah.
And this cemetery actually was established by the slave that my ancestor brought out, Reuben Shipley. He became a fairly successful farmer after he got his freedom, and coincidentally married Mary Jane Holmes, one of the Holmes daughters, who was central in the slavery case. And he later donated 3 acres of his land for this cemetery. And he had the understanding that he insisted that blacks could be buried in this cemetery along with whites. And this was a period when minorities often weren't allowed to be buried in Caucasian cemeteries. And so the cemetery was created with that understanding. And today, Reuben Shipley is buried there, Mary Jane Holmes is buried there, and many of my ancestors are buried there. So very successful in what he wanted to achieve.
Can you see the reason for the slavery? I mean, at first it's appalling, like we had slaves, oh geez, you know, but you can understand it on some level when they're trying to start a whole new way of life here, that they needed help and they didn't have any money to pay for that.
Well, I'm not sure that I do understand that fully, Jody, because most of the settlers came out without slaves.
Yeah.
And through their own hard labor, they tilled their land and they became farmers. And many of the settlers who fled Missouri in particular were actually fleeing slavery because they were mostly small farmers who didn't have slaves. And they found it very difficult to compete against landholders who did have slaves because of the difference in the cost of labor. So most of them came out, by far the vast majority were not slaveholders. And many of them were actually fleeing slavery. And then you had this handful, like Nathaniel Ford, Robert Shipley, and maybe another 100 who did bring out slaves. Some freed them right away, and others, like Nathaniel Ford, tried to keep them.
Yeah. So what was the Free Land Act? How did that work?
Well, it was called the Donation Land Act, but originally in 1843, 1844, the provisional government allowed people to stake claims for up to a square mile of land, and they just did it. And and it was empty land. Well, I should say empty. There were Native Americans on the land in Willamette Valley, the Calipunia Indians, for example. They were just pushed aside, and the land was taken. And then in 1850, the U.S. Congress enacted the Donation Land Act. And this basically confirmed the claims that the early settlers had up to a square mile of land for the very early settlers. And so they got their land for free. They had to live on it and they had to farm it. But it was only for whites. I mean, it specifically excluded blacks and Native Americans and Hawaiians, as a matter of fact.
Hawaiians also?
Hawaiian, oh yeah, there were quite a Hawaiian population in those days who were brought over as laborers and worked on the ships. And I mean, I say quite maybe 100, but they were specifically excluded from landholding.
Hey, if you're just tuning in, I'm visiting with Greg Nokes about his latest book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. And this is published by Oregon State University Press, right?
Yes, it is.
OSU Press. They always do such good work.
They do great work. They published my first book, and they published this one, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, they just do it feels good in your hand, and it's just, the cover's always good. It just feels good. Like, it feels like some care went into it.
Great cover.
So I've always liked that about them, and we've had a number of OSU Press authors on the show over the years. So, in your experience with doing all this research, who was the most interesting character to you?
Well, I think it was, that's a good question. I think it was Robin Holmes, without question, because he was illiterate, up against a very powerful slaveholder, managed to get attorneys to help him in his case, and in a region which was actually more or less pro-slavery, at least among the leadership, and he prevailed. And in looking through the court records of this case, it was all handwritten. And like I said, the records are in the Polk County Courthouse in Dallas. And you find all these cross-outs and changes and editing. And so you just knew that an attorney who was transcribing his statement and remarks then would be reading it back to Holmes, who would then suggest changes that would be made. So I'm assuming, I think correctly, that that's where are all these little changes in the text. But he was persisted through that trial and succeeded, I think, is very remarkable. It's heroic.
Yeah.
And he and his wife went on, Polly Holmes with his wife, and in 1863, they integrated a white church, helped to integrate a white church in Salem, the Congregational Church. It was one of the first times that blacks were allowed in white churches in Oregon. So I think he's the most remarkable figure. Sadly, there's no photograph that exists of him.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, there's no picture. There's one photograph of his daughter, Mary Jane Holmes, shortly before her death. And I have that in the book. But
so what was the name of the attorney who helped him? Was it
Reuben Boise, and he was a prosecuting attorney. He'd been appointed by the territorial government as a prosecuting attorney for Oregon.
Pretty young, though. He looked
very young.
Yeah.
And he was from Massachusetts, an abolitionist. And so obviously, because of his background and sympathies, he took Robin Holmes in hand and took his case.
Wow.
And it's quite a remarkable story.
Now, he's not related to Boise, Idaho, is he?
I wouldn't be surprised if there is a relationship of some sort, but I don't know what that might be.
Wow. So, in your family history, was this on your on your mother's side of the family, I guess?
On my mother's side of the family, most of my early ancestors came out in separate wagon trains in 1853. And most came out from Iowa and originally West Virginia through Iowa. And they were non-slaveholders. But there was this one family, the Robert Shipley family in Miller County, Missouri, who did bring out one slave. And I might mention a few things about Reuben Shipley. The understanding with him, as with others, was if you come to Oregon and you help me establish my farm, then I will free you. Mm-hmm. And this apparently was the case with Reuben Shipley. However, he had to make a difficult choice because he had to leave behind his wife and 2 children who were owned by other slave owners. So he could not bring them out. So he had to leave them behind. Never saw them again. So think of that.
Yeah.
Coming all this way, all those 2,000 miles, not knowing if you'd ever see your family, and indeed you didn't. Robert Shipley, the white Shipley, also had 2 female slaves, and they had the same choice, and their choice was to stay with their families, and they didn't come out. But Reuben Shipley, as I said, after he was freed, he worked hard, saved money, became a successful farmer, raised a family in Benton County.
What kind of crops did he raise?
See, I had 100 and my acreage right here, I think 108 acres altogether on what is now known as Nebeck Hill, which is right next to the town of Philomath. And the cemetery is right at the top of that hill now, called Mount Union Cemetery. And he had corn. He had his own cattle, and was a small farmer, I'm sure, but successful.
Wow, good for him.
Yeah, good for him.
I mean, really good for him. So if you're just tuning in, I'm Jody C., and this program is Backpage, and we're visiting with Greg Nokes about his latest work, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. Where can people get this book?
You can get it almost anywhere. It's selling very well in bookstores. Powell's, obviously, for one, in Portland, Broadway Books, Annie Bloom's, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, of course, and all the Seattle stores are carrying it. And I imagine independents everywhere around Oregon are carrying it.
Have you ever been to Wallace Books over in the Selwood?
You've mentioned that before. I've talked to them on the phone. I've not actually been there, but I imagine you can get it there too.
Yeah, it's a great little bookstore.
It's selling very well because it's had excellent reviews.
Well,
so far.
You've been promoting everywhere. Where have you been? And you were written up in the Oregonian, and you were on OPB the other day.
The Think Out Loud.
Yeah.
You can go on the book website, breakingchainsbook.com, to find out the whole list of appearances. I'll be in Seattle area in September up there. So quite a few appointments scheduled. But before we leave, I'd like to make a point about the book.
Yeah.
I think this is an extremely important book in Oregon, and I'm delighted that Oregon State Press, an academic institution, has published it because it's important history. We need to know these stories, this story in particular, so we'll know where we were, how far we've come, and how far we still have to go, and giving justice to people who need justice, and the people who may have been trampled upon as we achieve what we did achieve in this state.
Yeah. Well, it was a jolt. It was a jolt to realize that we actually had slavery in this state. I mean, I just was like, what? That can't be.
And that's the case with most people.
Yeah.
I mean, they're academics. Darrell Milner at Portland State University, a professor of Black Studies, helped me a lot on this book, and he was aware of a lot of that history. Or Quintard Taylor, a professor of Black Studies at the University of Washington, the same with him. But it was mostly known in academic circles. It really hasn't been in Oregon history books, where it belongs. For example, we haven't talked about the exclusion laws. Oregon had 3 exclusion laws over its history that banned blacks, banned free blacks from living in the state. The first was enacted in 1844 and repealed in 1845. The second was enacted in 1849 and repealed in 1854. And the third one, incredibly, was written into the Oregon Constitution. And this prohibited free blacks from living in Oregon. It wasn't removed from the Constitution until 1926. And it was never really enforced. But think about it. The fact that this was in the Constitution was certainly a message to blacks around the country
Yeah.
that you aren't particularly welcome
Yeah.
in Oregon. And I think this is one of the explanations why Oregon is such a white state. There aren't that many blacks living here.
Well, so what's the reception? Have you given the presentations on this in the black community?
Very strong. Like I said,
Yeah.
Darrell Milner has been very supportive of this. I got a call from Quinter Taylor yesterday just complimenting me on the book, and these are both black folks and quite a few. Yes, I've had excellent reception, but keep in mind it's just been out couple of weeks,
Yeah.
so not all the reception is in. But the Seattle Times review is written by a black columnist up there, and he praised the book. So I think it's been pretty well accepted in the black community, which is important to me.
Sure.
Just like Massacred for Gold was well accepted in the Chinese community in the Northwest, and that's rewarding to me.
So what other secrets do we have that you're going to air?
Well, we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll sit down with my brother again, have a cup of coffee, and
Right.
see what he knows.
Right.
Good.
So, and now you were a newspaper reporter.
I was for about 40 years, yes.
Okay. Well, for the Oregonian.
I was with the Associated Press on the East Coast, and I was a foreign correspondent in Latin America and covered the State Department for the AP. But I was a native Oregonian, is obvious. And so I came back in 1986 and joined the Oregonian, was there for the final 15 years of my career, and came across the Chinese book as a reporter. And then when I retired, I wrote that, and then I came across this one, thanks to my brother. And I've dedicated the book to my late grandparents, Minnie and Will Junkin, and there's reason for that, because they had written in a family genealogy about the slave Reuben Shipley. And I had never read the genealogy, but my brother had, and that's why he pointed out that particular item. And so I thought how wonderful that they have kept alive this story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, we're going to have to head on out of here. So thank you so much. We've been visiting with Greg Nokes about his new book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. So pick it up wherever your favorite independent bookstore is. I'm Jody C. This program is Back Page. Join us again next time as we take another peek at the back page. And remember, we're all in this together. More the same than different. Do your best.
Thank you, Jody.
Thanks.
Pleasure being here again.